Hello and welcome to Dotting the I in Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob and this is episode 7. This week I want to talk about the trope that we only use 10% of our brain power, but before we get to that, some quick housekeeping. Last week I wrote a blog post about the work-life balance and my ongoing struggle to tame it. On Tuesday I released a free flash fiction story called The Lottery. I did a review of Episode 10, War Stories of Firefly, and my Patreon exclusive flash fiction for last week was called Helvius, and it was written from the prompt Mundane Gods. Next week there'll be a blog, a free story, a review, a Patreon exclusive, and a podcast, so keep your ears and eyes peeled. The last couple of weeks have been a bit of a struggle to get everything sort of organised. There's been a lot more stuff to do with footy in the last couple of weeks because it's the end of the season and you want to finish on a high note, as well as work, things changing and trying to fit everything in and work everything out and keep the boss happy. After a couple of weeks of not being able to find regular time to make content, I pushed out 4 writing pieces yesterday and I'm recording this podcast before I go to work tonight. I don't know whether I'll have enough time to get the editing done, but I will be able to get that done in the morning if I don't get it done between now and then. So, at least I've been able to make some kind of catch up, and I need to push this week as well, and I want to be doing at least 2 pieces every day until I've caught up and got a bit of extra work done. So, I want to have, ideally, be completely caught up by the 1st of September, which gives me this week to do essentially 2 weeks worth of work. So, I can do it, and I will find the time to do it. With no footy means that I've got time on Thursday that I don't normally have, so I've got a bit more time this week than I normally have, so I'm going to try and take advantage of it and get things back on an even keel. Even though the footy season itself is finished, there's still lingering commitments to footy for jobs that need to get done, other family commitments that I need to do, but life will definitely be easier in the coming months. Summer tends to have a bit more time than winter in the way that my life has worked out this way, and I definitely hope that by the time that the footy season comes around again next year, I am not working the same kind of hours that I'm working now, one way or the other. Let's hope. I've got 6 months to organise a better life between now and then. I would like to thank those that have supported me on Patreon. Currently, my Wall of Awesome has only 3 names on it, and if you can get your awesomeness level up, you can reach the top of it, a place currently dominated by Zev and Art. If you get some entertainment from my work, then think about giving me a hand to make more of it by contributing on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can get access to 9 exclusive Patreon stories, with a new one added each week. If you want to contribute but you don't have any cash to spare, that's cool too. I was a poor uni student for a long time and I'm just glad that I could help make your day a little better. But if you want to help, you can still sing my praises to everyone you meet, put a comment or a rating on the podcast, stop random people in the street and tell them to check out my work, hijack the local radio station and play a loop of my podcasts, or even build a giant space laser and use it to burn my website address into the face of the moon. What I'm saying is, I really appreciate any level of support you can give. The topic for this week is the rubbish trope that we only use 10% of our brains, and that somehow we can access more of our brains and then become smarter. This trope has been around for a long time, and it keeps coming up in pop culture even today, even though we know for a fact that we use more than 10% of our brains. We use our entire brain. Our brain doesn't just have a bunch of matter in it that we don't use for no reason. That wouldn't make any evolutionary sense. Anyway, so stories like Limitless and Lucy are the recent movies that are built around this topic. I mean, it's bad enough that someone might casually mention this trope, but for movies that are built around the entire idea that somehow this person has accessed the extra part of their brain that they weren't using, and it turns out they're a genius, is, I don't know, it's incredulous beyond belief at this point. Every time I see the trope, I just hang my head in shame. I'm not quite sure where the myth actually came from. It's been around for at least a couple of centuries, so I wouldn't be surprised if it came from... I mean, there's always been this myth that we might be able to access untapped potential, or that we might get some extra power from the muses that we don't have access to as, our mortal selves. Personally, I think it's got something to do with, the early brain experiments, because you can cut into a brain without necessarily destroying function. The brain consists primarily of neuron cells that do the parts of the brain work that we associate with brain, and glial cells that do functions to support those cells. You can remove glial cells without... I mean, there's always a cost, but you can remove glial cells without as much of loss of function. You can't really remove neurons without loss of function, but we also know that cutting into the brain, even in the glial cells, does cause some loss of function. There's always a trade-off to any brain surgery. I imagine that the trope comes from early 19th century brain cutting experiments where they're able to cut into someone's brain, or they're able to see someone with a significant brain injury where they didn't lose any function. I mean, there's a famous case with a guy called Phineas Gage who accidentally shot himself in the face with a railway equipment, and he put a steel spike up through his chin and into his brain, but so he didn't lose any function to wander around or do things, but he had a complete personality change because the spike punctured his prefrontal cortex, which is where your personality is kept. So I don't know, I think that's where the trope comes from. It's a terrible trope. It's been constantly used in advertisements, in self-help books. You still see it today, and it really just gets under my skin. I see it and I think, why do people even listen to this? You should immediately discount any advertising that uses a ridiculous false premise that doesn't make any sense. And then even when we see it in fiction, I mean, if it's fiction that's based on the real world, like stories like Lucy or Limitless that are based in essentially the IRL world, and then you can just take a pill or drugs or whatever, it's usually drugs, to access the extra part of your brain that you're not using and gain magic powers. Now, there's some obvious rebuttals to this terrible myth, in that brain studies have been conducted with considerable accuracy as we've gained better medical technologies over the last 50 years. We're able to study brain damage, and we're able to study using things like functional fMRIs, where the brain activity is, and we're able to see that there's localization of function, but also that no part of the brain is not used in day-to-day doing things. Whilst there are sections of the brain that have specific tasks, there are also a wide variety of tasks that we do on day-to-day. Now, I mean, it makes sense that we don't have any excess parts of our brains that we're not using, because there's I think in medical terms it's called synaptic pruning. It's the idea that brain cells that we're not using have a tendency to degenerate and not be have many connections to, and be sometimes reabsorbed into the body and reused, which makes sense. The brain is incredibly costly as an organ, Our brains use a ridiculous proportion of our body's resources. They use massive amounts of oxygen, massive amounts of nutrients. Your brain can use up to 20% of your body's total energy for the day. And if the organ is so energy intensive, why would we have extra parts of it that would make it use energy that the body doesn't need? I mean, it stands to reason that basic Darwinian evolution would say that the humans that had the same brain function but required less energy were the ones better adapted to survive. So the reason that I think that this trope is terrible and should be retired is not just that it is in itself bad, but as an example of terrible tropes that are just bad science, that shouldn't be part of the common zeitgeist, the common knowledge that people have. Because people who don't know that much science will think that it's true. I've heard people tell me this earnestly, that they honestly think that humans only use 10% of their brains when it's clearly not true. Fiction definitely has many functions, and certainly entertainment doesn't require truth necessarily. But I think it's also damaging when entertainment contains common false tropes that people will take as true because of how commonly they're used. If people are seeing some common piece of thing told to them over and over again, like, say, for instance, that humans only use 10% of our brains, and that, there's a possible magic drug out there that will allow us to access the mystical parts of our brains that will make us super smart, and that the difference between a smart person and a dumb person is the percentage of their brain that they use. I mean, that's absurd. And I suppose in some ways it kind of falls into a narrative that you don't have to work to become smart. You don't have to study things and put in the effort and the time and the hard work in order to become a scholar. Which, no one should believe. Do you think a carpenter becomes a master carpenter by just magically taking a pill and having the ability? I'm sure that you could write a half-decent fiction story where that was the case, but if every fiction story over and over again was telling you that you could just take a pill and magically become a master craftsman, then I think we should probably get rid of that trope. I suppose this is part of a larger conversation about what the purpose of fiction really is. Is it just for entertainment? Does it have any responsibilities? Does fiction have a responsibility not to tell common lies that people will believe? Personally, I think the answer to that is yes and no. There's a difference in my mind, at least, between having common tropes like building a world that has robots in it, or aliens, or fantastic worlds with warp drive, and putting in things that are fake for today's real life. So the difference between writing a story with an FTL drive and writing a story where you take a pill and you suddenly have access to, in quotes, the other 90% of your brain that you're not using. The difference is that that's something that's happening right now. If you tell people that they can go and get a train ticket and fly to Venus, and that's in every story over and over again, and people will think that they can just go on holiday on Venus, well, that's kind of harmful. If people think that we can go to Venus right now, they're not going to be spending any time working out how to go to Venus. Okay, I think my point's kind of getting a bit wide of the mark. But what I'm saying is, there are definitely people out there who will honestly believe that this trope is true, and I don't think that we should be constantly telling people lies that actually affect their day-to-day life. Fiction can definitely be used as a teaching mechanism. I mean, think back to early civilization. We had all these common fictional stories about what the gods did and how they worked and how things came to be, why the bees have a sting and why certain star constellations are the way that they are, and all these explanations of how the universe is around us and why things work in a certain way. And those stories were part of a cultural framework to allow education to be taught to the masses. So before there were schools, before there were, the old school philosopher schools, even in ancient Greece, people commonly knew the stories about the gods, and they commonly knew the lessons and moral teachings that were being taught to them through this story method. When I was little, my godfather gave me a book of Aesop's fables, and Aesop was a real person who lived at around 600 BCE, who wrote down a bunch of fables that have to do with, it's the grasshopper and the ant story is an Aesop fable, the dog that dropped his bone in the pond. These are stories that have a moral component that help to teach us certain important life lessons. Should we be, doing the work to make sure that we have enough store for the winter, or should we be worrying about our short-term day-to-day pleasures? Should we be trying to take what other people have and not being content with what we already have? These fables are written at the same time as the god myths of how Aphrodite was born from the... Oh, let's not even go into it. I think that might be a little bit outside of the typical, what's considered to be family-friendly methods of the podcast. But the stories of the gods were brutal and also had an important purpose. They were trying to teach why things were the way they were. Why do the seasons happen? Why does the moon and the sun seem to go around every however many hours? Why do rivers flood? Why does it rain? Why do the things happen? The god stories also had a moral component as well to try and teach. And so, whilst I veered wildly off topic for a moment, what I'm trying to say is that fictional stories do have a way of being not just for entertainment but also for teaching. And I think constantly adding in something which is known to be false into stories is something that we should try to avoid at all costs. There are definitely people out there who will never even bother to Google search some claim that they hear. There are people out there that are not skeptical really at all and won't fact check on their own. People learn in all different kinds of ways, and some people don't particularly go back to the well. They don't keep that curious element that children have. They seem to sort of grow out of it. They get enough knowledge to be able to do what it is they want to do, and then they don't really go back and examine the claims that people make about things. And that's just an evolutionary strategy in order to be able to survive. I mean, if everyone was constantly going out and trying to go over that next hill and trying to spend all their day reading and learn about new things, well, that's an incredibly intensive, energy intensive way to live your life, and it was also not a productive way, right? Just spending your time learning is not spending your time producing. Some people need to produce, some people need to learn. And I think during times in your life, sometimes you need to learn and sometimes you need to produce. If you just spend all your time learning, you're not spending any time earning any money, and then you can't pay the rent. So I find it wholly unsurprising that there are people out there who are not going to necessarily fact check claims and are willing to believe things on face value that they're told, because it's exactly what I would expect from some people. Because some people need to be conservative and some people need to be progressive. in order for society to continue to move forward and not completely stagnate, but also not spend all of its energy on pie in the sky things and never actually get anything done. There needs to be a balance between the two mindsets in order to both survive and progress, in order to make things easier into the future. Or, if not necessarily make things easier into the future, I mean, just if you think about the changing conditions that we evolved into, it wasn't necessarily a quick thing, but changing just from the, let's say, the Mikhailovich cycles that change every 26,000 years, that makes the planet slightly drier or slightly wetter based on the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. If you have some people being conservative about this is the way that we find water, and then the water is no longer there anymore because the planet has dried, then you're not going to survive. But you also need some people being like, well, okay, there's no water, we need to find some water, let's go out and do it. But if they're not tempered, if they're constantly being like, well, we need to be on the move, then you're not using the resources that you have at hand, you're spending too much energy, and then you're not going to survive either. You're going to run out of energy because you're not actually using what you have at hand. All this is to say that this trope that we only use 10% of our brains is stupid, and I really, really wish that we would stop using it in stories, but I honestly don't think that it is going to happen. I think people are going to fall back into that well of commonly known tropes in order to help tell their story quicker and without the effort of telling a good story. Anyway, so next week's work, Tuesday, I have a story prompt called Aliens Make Stupid First Contact. I'll see what I can do with that. The review that I'm going to do next Wednesday will be a review of Silence of the Lambs. My Thursday story, the prompt is Time Traveling Yankee in Reverse. I'll see if I can make that good. And the topic for next week's podcast is, are aliens always smarter than us? Remember, if you'd like to send me some suggestions for prompts for stories, you're more than welcome to. And you can send a prompt, a comment, a question, or just tell me how bad a writer I am to contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter at BobLynchBSC. If you like what I do and you want to help me make more of it, then check out my Patreon at patreon.com/RobertLynch. As always, check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.